Hello and welcome back. My name is Heather Hall. I'm a registered dietitian and a certified leap therapist, and I specialize in teaching you how to beat chronic disease and eat your way back to health. This video is for my clients who are getting ready to complete week 4 of the 4-week Jumpstart program in preparation for your LEAP protocol. So congratulations on completing your first 3 weeks. I hope you've learned a lot and made a lot of great habit changes, and you are really setting yourself up for success not only with your LEAP protocol, but just going forward in the future. Week 4 is all about managing your macros. We'll talk more about what that means in a moment, but first I want you to be sure that you take a moment to reflect on how week 3 went for you. Write that down in the space provided in your workbook. And these times of reflection are a really important part of change and the learning process, so please don't skip this step. Also, I want to hear all about your feedback when we have our next consultation, so be sure to make some notes there for me. I want to take a moment here to talk about progress versus perfection again. So as you go forward making these changes in your diet, an ebb and a flow in the nutritional quality of your diet is going to be perfectly normal. We are in a phase of learning and hyper consciousness right now, and so we are going to be extra aware of what we're doing and extra strict about it. But as we finish up working together and you move forward with life, there is going to be an ebb and flow to the nutritional quality of your diet. And that's perfectly normal. There's going to be times in life where things might just get really crazy or busy for you, or there's something else that demands precedence over diet quality in your life, and you have to give your effort and attention to that. And in those times, hopefully you've developed some strategies and some convenient ways of eating healthy so that you can deal with them without totally going backwards. But occasionally, nutrition will take a back seat to some other things. So when this happens in your life, as it inevitably will, do not think that you have failed. This is not a diet where you're either on it or off of it. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of eating. You understand now why you should do these things and what you should do. You know, hopefully by this point, that it makes a difference for you and how you feel. And so this is going to be a game changer for you going forward. And I just want you to know that even though occasionally you may fall backwards a little bit in some of your habits, those are really great learning opportunities and reminders for why you did this in the first place. And so that will help you to really want to get back on that wagon when you're ready and bump up that nutritional quality again. And hopefully it will be an upward spiral for you. And so sometimes you will be moving up and progressing and learning some more new habits and tips and tricks and things that help you. Other times you will be kind of moving down a little bit, but you will spiral back up again, and it will just be a continual process where you will be moving up in your progress and in your ability to eat and take care of yourself rather than downwards. And so don't feel like if you mess up that you are just done for and that there's no going back. That's not the case at all. We are just looking for progress, not perfection. And remember that an ebb and a flow in the nutritional quality of your diet is normal. We will be extra strict and we will be hyper conscious during these next few months because we're in a therapeutic stage and we're trying to heal your body and get you better. But once you have reclaimed some of your health and you are in a better place, you will need to continue a healthy lifestyle, but the strictness and the hyper awareness is not going to be necessary. This way of life is going to be second nature to you, and you're going to be just fine. Now let's dive in and talk about managing your macros. So what do I mean by macros? By macros, I mean macronutrients. And the macronutrients are the ones that you get calories or energy from. They're the ones that fuel your body. So there's 3 of them. There's protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Remember your PFC? So that the protein, fat, and carbohydrate are the 3 macronutrients. You eat them in large amounts, hence the macro name, and they provide energy for your body. So they are really important. Micronutrients are your vitamins and your minerals and things like that that you're eating in much smaller amounts. So macronutrients, you'll be eating, dozens to hundreds of grams a day of those. Whereas your micronutrients, you may be eating at most 1 gram a day, but most of them we need in very small amounts. They're super important, but we only need very small amounts of them, micrograms or milligrams. I am not talking about some of the fad diets out there, like the macrobiotic diet, or in a lot of weight loss methods, they'll talk about counting your macros and you got to track grams of stuff and count calories. I am not talking about that. I rarely ask my clients to count calories or grams of what they're doing. Sometimes it serves a good purpose, but rarely will I ask a client to do that because I think that for most people it does more harm than good. It's not a sustainable habit. And it's just not something I feel serves most people well in the short term and especially in the long term. Now, we want to balance our macros, especially during this therapeutic process. And if you are following the plate method, then you have been balancing your macros, or at least you've been getting better at it at this point. So if you're following that plate method pretty good, you're going to maybe have somewhere around 30% protein, 30% or 40% carbohydrate, and the rest of that as fat. Maybe even a little bit lower than that in your carbs and proteins, maybe a little higher in the fat, and that's fine too. There really is a wide range of macronutrients that our bodies can work with, and what we want to do moving forward for you is kind of find that sweet spot. So we're going to continue right now to keep the carbohydrate percentage pretty low, which is considered below 30% of your calories coming from carbohydrate. I would say is a nice moderate carbohydrate intake. Now keep in mind that as you have decreased likely the amount of carbohydrates in your diet, that means that your fats and your proteins need to be bumped up then in order for you to get enough calories in. And starvation is not good for your health. I don't recommend that you are making yourself go hungry on purpose or not even on accident. You need to honor your hunger and fullness signals. You need to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full, and feed your body when it needs to be fed. Honor those signals. Your body knows what it needs. Now, for many people, those hunger and satiety signals have been suppressed from, perhaps even from childhood for you, because sometimes as parents, we like to dictate what and how much our kids eat and, make them clean their plates or whatever it may be that helps them to unlearn those natural cues that they have in their bodies. But I really want you to get back in touch with those cues. Honor your hunger, honor it early, and also honor your satiety. But most of all, I want you to focus on honoring your hunger and eating at the first signals of feeling hungry. Don't wait until you're ravenous, because at the point where you feel ravenous, you will be out of control, and it's very difficult to stop eating when you are ravenous. And pay attention to that, because there's going to be a time where, going forward, where you're trying to honor your hunger, you're eating early, and then, at some point there's going to be an occasion arise where you are hungry and you're not able to eat until much later. And just notice how difficult it is to stop eating once you've reached that ravenous stage. And so that is why I really want you to practice being an intuitive eater and listening to those inner signals, because your body already knows when you need fed and it knows when to stop. You just have to get back in touch with those intuitive eating signals. Occasionally, I do find it helpful to use a food tracking tool to see what the ratio is of your protein to carbs to fat. And when you do this, you need to do it over the course of a few days generally, and to get an idea of kind of your average, because every day is going to vary a little bit. But there's only one tracking tool I found online that I really like so far, and that is Cronometer.com, CRONO meter.com. And the reason I like that one is because it doesn't focus just on calories, fat, protein, carbs like most of the other ones do. It also lists out the micronutrients as well. So how does your diet look as far as quality? Are you getting a lot of vitamins and minerals and amino acids and those essential fatty acids in your diet? So this tracking tool will tell you that. I feel like it's really easy to use. So that is the app I recommend. For most people, it's not a good idea to track all of the time. But if you're curious, you could take 3 or 4 days this week and use that tracking tool and kind of see what your average is as far as your macronutrient ratios go. And then also take a peek at how you're doing on your vitamins and your mineral intake. Are you still falling short in some areas? And if you do find that you're really low, go ahead and just do a Google search. You know, if I'm low in vitamin A intake in my diet, what foods can I eat that are going to be high in vitamin A and can bump that back up again? So I think that that can be really useful every now and again. Don't get sucked into that diet mentality and the counting calories and obsessing about all of that. I want you to take a look and see really what percentage are you getting of calories? What percentage are you getting of fat to carbohydrate to protein ratios? And do you need to adjust your plate method a little bit? Maybe you are still piling the carb side of the plate a little higher than you thought you were, and you'd like to bring that down a little bit, especially if you know you have blood sugar control issues. Moving forward in this program, we will work together as we near the end of it to kind of see how are you feeling on the plate method. Are you still feeling better and more energetic, or do you possibly need to change your ratios a little bit? And for a lot of people, they'll do really well on the ratios of the plate method. But for others, we might need to make some adjustments. So let me give you some ideas of what this might be. Some people that might do really well on a very, very low carb diet, like less than 10% of your calories coming from carbohydrate, this would typically be not forever, but as a therapeutic transitory diet. Maybe somebody that has neurological issues like epilepsy or Alzheimer's, or someone with really severe blood sugar controlled problems, we might bring those carbohydrate ratios down really low to help overcome the insulin resistance and get things working normally again. And my experience has been that those people are, after a few months, able to raise their carbohydrate intake up without affecting their blood sugars eventually. You just need to give your body some time to heal and your cells to become less insulin resistant. So a low carbohydrate diet would be maybe 10 to 15% of your calories coming from carbohydrate. And this would be helpful for, again, blood sugar regulation, somebody that maybe has some mood disturbances or some digestive problems. You might bump it up as high as 30%. That would be like a moderate intake for just being generally healthy, maintaining your weight. Somebody with adrenal fatigue or hypothyroid. Somebody that might do well though by loosening up that carbohydrate intake a little bit more, above 30%, is going to be your athletes or really active people are going to need more carbohydrate, or they're going to be sluggish in their workouts. Somebody that's trying to put on weight or gain muscle is actually going to need a little bit higher carbohydrate. And somebody that has perhaps like a fast metabolism, or if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, you're going to want to have a little bit higher carbohydrate intake, above 30% most likely, in order to have optimal energy and to feel your best. So it really is just a matter of playing around with it and seeing where you feel best at. But for the course of the program, we're going to keep it pretty low for you, unless, talk to me, tell me if you're having issues, and we can play around with the ratio earlier. But it tends to be really good as a therapy for a little while to keep it nice and moderate for the course of this program. So let's talk about each of the macronutrients in a little more depth. I want to begin with fats. There is a lot of controversy and confusion surrounding fat in our diet. So Most people today are really scared of eating fat. They believe that fat makes them fat and that fat causes heart disease. For decades, the recommendation from trusted organizations has been to eat low-fat diets, low cholesterol diets, but common sense and a lot of new evidence is telling us otherwise, that perhaps the low-fat recommendations aren't the best for our health. First of all, I want you to understand the role of fats in your diet and in your health. So fats are a major source of energy for you, and they pack more than twice the calories per gram as protein and carbohydrate, which is why a lot of people are afraid of them when they're dieting, because it's easier to get more calories in with fat. However, they have a lot of important roles. So certain fats are essential that we get from our food. That means that your body needs to get them from your food. Your body cannot make them from something else. Fat also helps you to absorb a lot of different vitamins. First of all, the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, most of which Americans are deficient in already. Those are going to be found in fatty foods, and they're also going to need to be absorbed in the presence of fat in your digestive system. So if you're not eating enough fat, you're not going to be absorbing those nutrients. And there was a 2004 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that showed that dietary fat was necessary for the absorption of a lot of nutrients, even from fruits and vegetables. So beyond the fat-soluble ones, in the study, people that consumed salads with fat-free dressings absorbed far less of helpful phytonutrients and vitamins from spinach, lettuce, tomatoes, and carrots than those that consumed their salads with a salad dressing containing fat. So put that fatty dressing on your salad and you're going to get more nutrition from it. Fat is needed to build all of the cell membranes in all of your body. So the exterior of each cell is actually made up in part of fatty acids, and the sheaths surrounding your nerves are also made of fat. They are essential for blood clotting. They are essential for regulating inflammation. So if you have something like rheumatoid arthritis, and we know you have a lot of inflammation going on, a very low-fat diet is actually not recommended, because we know that fat can help with inflammation. Fat is also really important for increasing your feelings of satiety and reducing your cravings when you're eating. So it really does help us to feel fuller for longer. And one study even showed that eating a high-fat diet can increase your metabolism by about 30%. So while you're getting more calories from your fat, it's also helping you to eat less because you feel fuller, and it's helping you to feel fuller for longer. And it might also be boosting your metabolism. So even though you might eat more calories, you're burning more calories as well. And I feel like the low-fat craze of the 80s and 90s and even 2000s has really increased our carbohydrate, and especially our refined carbohydrate and sugar intake, and probably contribute to a lot of nutrient deficiencies and increased the obesity and heart disease rates in our country. I don't think the low-fat recommendations have really done us any favors. So we are going to talk today about the different types of fatty acids that make up fat molecules. So fatty acids are basically long hydrocarbon chains that can be saturated, meaning that they'll be straight, basically, monounsaturated, meaning that they'll have one bend in the chain, or polyunsaturated, meaning that they'll have two or more bends in the chain. And those simple bends in their chains affect a lot of their behaviors and what they do in their bodies. And that's oversimplifying it a little bit. But I think that will help to give you a visual in your head as you're learning the difference between these types of fats. So saturated fats are going to be solid at room temperature. They're very stable and they tend to be just not as reactive as the other fatty acids. The chains can be short, medium, or long, but they're saturated with hydrogens the whole way through, meaning they're nice and tight and straight. That's why part of the reason why they're solid at room temperature is because they can pack together closely. They don't have those kinks in their chains that are making them fit together funny and be more fluid. And that's also why they're more stable when you cook with them and things like that. So one of the reasons why we believed for a long time that saturated fats were harmful was because a few decades ago, when heart disease was really skyrocketing and becoming a major health issue, the observation was made that saturated fats in your diet tend to increase the amount of cholesterol in your blood, and cholesterol in the blood had been associated with a higher heart disease risk. The jump in reasoning was then made that if saturated fats increase cholesterol and cholesterol increases heart disease, that saturated fats cause heart disease. Saturated fats do tend to raise cholesterol levels in the body, but they affect the good cholesterol as well as the bad. And also the bad cholesterol, or the LDL cholesterol, there are subtypes of that cholesterol, some of them harmful, some of them not, and so not all LDL cholesterol is even bad. It turns out that diets that are higher in fat actually increase the good LDL cholesterol, and that diets that are high in carbohydrate actually increase the bad LDL cholesterol. And so it goes back to the principles that we've been learning in this Jumpstart program, and there's usually more than one reason for why I'm having you do each of these steps, and this is just one more reason why. Because a lower carb, higher fat diet actually probably decreases your risk of heart disease. And I'm going to show you some more studies that seem to confirm this. So several recent review studies, which is a study where they go in and they combine the evidence from a whole bunch of other studies that have been done. So there's several recent review studies on saturated fat that have actually concluded that there is absolutely no link between saturated fat intake and heart disease risk. You can also look at a graph and see that right around the time when the low-fat recommendations came out is the same time that the obesity rates skyrocketed. So as fat intakes went down, obesity rates actually have gone up. Let's take a look at just a few more studies on saturated fats so you can kind of see where the research is going with this. So a 2015 systematic review looked at 15 randomized controlled trials over 59,000 participants, and the conclusion there was that the people that had reduced their saturated fat intake were just as likely to die or to get heart attacks or strokes compared to those that ate more saturated fat. Another 2015 study published in the British Medical Journal, they concluded that people who consume more saturated fat were not more likely to experience heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, or death from any cause compared to those who ate less saturated fat. Another meta-analysis published in 2010 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, they concluded that there was no association between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. A 2014 study, which is also a systematic review and meta-analysis, it reviewed cohort studies and randomized controlled trials. So what they concluded was that people with higher saturated fat intakes were not at an increased risk of heart disease or sudden death. In a 2014 study, this one was a systematic review looking at body weight and the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and cancer, and they concluded that eating saturated fat does not increase the risk of heart disease or type 2 diabetes. However, they found that partially replacing saturated fat with some polyunsaturated fats could help reduce the risk of heart disease, especially for men. So, in summary, Reducing saturated fat doesn't seem to have any effect on the risk of heart disease or death. Replacing saturated fats with refined carbohydrates will increase your risk of heart disease, and replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats may reduce the risk of cardiovascular events, but it makes no difference as far as heart attacks, strokes, or death. And then a huge new study published in the fall of 2017, or late summer perhaps. This was called the PURE study. They looked at the eating habits of 135,000 adults in 18 countries, high income, median income, low income nations, and they followed the participants' health for more than 7 years on average. Those in the study with the highest fat intakes, so more than 35% of their calories coming from fat, were actually 23% less likely to die during the course of the study than those that had the lowest fat intakes, or less than 10% of their calories coming from fats. Cardiovascular disease rates were roughly the same across fat intakes, while strokes were actually less common among those with the highest fat intakes. It also found, again, that carbohydrate intake went in the opposite direction. So those that had 77% or more of their daily calories coming from carbohydrate were 28% more likely to die during the study. Those that had less than 46% of their calories coming from carbohydrate had the lowest death rates. Now keep in mind that you're going to be getting a mix of saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated fats from all of the foods that you eat. So for instance, canola oil is going to be about 6% saturated fat and about 58% monounsaturated fats, with the rest being polyunsaturated fats. So it's a mix there. So for instance, olive oil, right? Olive oil is considered a monounsaturated fat. So 77% of olive oil is monounsaturated fats, but 14% of it is actually saturated fat, and the rest would be polyunsaturated. And so there's no food source that's completely saturated or completely unsaturated, even though that's often how we refer to it. So beef we refer to as what type of fat generally? Saturated, right? However, beef is actually only about 50% saturated fat and about 40% monounsaturated fats, with roughly 10% being polyunsaturated fats. And so just keep in mind that you're getting a whole range of different fatty acid profiles in the different foods you're eating. So beef is not totally saturated, and olive oil is not completely monounsaturated. A note on cholesterol: the recommendations have been to eat low cholesterol diets. So there's actually no evidence that dietary cholesterol raises blood cholesterol, and low cholesterol recommendations were actually finally lifted for the dietary guidelines for Americans in 2015. Cholesterol is needed to make a lot of different hormones in your body that regulate things like your blood sugar and your menstrual cycle and your blood pressure and your testosterone and male characteristics, cortisol, which regulates things like stress response and inflammation, thyroid function. So all of those things depend on having adequate cholesterol to build them from. And so a very low cholesterol diet may not be helpful, especially if you're struggling with some of those things. So let's talk about monounsaturated fats quickly. So there's a lot of evidence that monounsaturated fats are helpful, that they reduce the risk of heart disease, that they reduce insulin resistance, they can reverse adipose tissue dysfunction, that would help with weight loss, they can improve mood, reduce anger, they can reduce the risk of some cancers, and they're anti-inflammatory. So monounsaturated, there's really no debate that they're a really positive thing to include in your diet. Some good sources of your monounsaturated fats are going to be olives and avocados and their oils, and then you'll get smaller amounts of them from a lot of other foods as well. So if you are hesitant about upping the amount of fat that you include in your diet, monounsaturated fats are a really safe place to start because there really is no doubt in the research that they do improve our health. Polyunsaturated fats, there's two main types. Those are your omega-6s and your omega-3s. Omega-6 fats are going to be found primarily in your vegetable oils, your industrial seed oils, so your corn, soybean, canola, all of those oils that we get from foods that really require an industrial process to extract those oils from them. And they're going to be very high in omega-6s. Omega-6s are really important to have in small amounts in your diet because they do help to regulate your immune system, but they're pro-inflammatory. So they're kind of like the gas pedal for your immune system and for inflammation in high amounts. Omega-3s are more like the brakes for the immune system. So they kind of turn the immune response down a little bit. And so it's like when you're driving a car and you have better control over the speed of the car when you have both a gas pedal and a brake, right? So when we have both omega-6s and omega-3s in our diets, then they can regulate our immune system better. And so we need both, but we need them in the proper ratios. So omega-3s are going to be found in flax seeds, chia seeds, leafy greens, some nuts and seeds. Omega-6s are also in nuts and seeds in small amounts. Fish oils or cold water fish are also going to be another great source of omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. So eating that a couple times a week can help to boost up that omega-3 ratio. And they're really important for, again, turning down the immune response. They reduce the risk of heart disease, autoimmune disease, they improve brain health. And the ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s should be somewhere around 3-to-1 so that you have control over both the brakes and the gas in your immune system. The problem with the standard American diet is that our ratio is typically 20-to-1. So we have way more of the pro-inflammatory omega-6s in our diet than we do of the anti-inflammatory omega-3s. And the problem with this is that we are already dealing with a lot of inflammation, and so that's only making the situation worse. And I do not recommend using vegetable oil, corn oil, soybean oil, or a lot of canola oil in your diet because that gives us omega-6 fatty acids in an unnaturally high amount. So if you're just to eat naturally whole foods that have small amounts of omega-6s in them, like the nuts and seeds, then that's going to be fine. You're going to be getting the right ratios of those. But when we start cooking with those oils and adding them to our dressings, then it really bumps up the amount of omega-6s that we're getting way above the ratio of omega-3s. Another problem with using vegetable oils to cook with is that they're made up of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are really just unstable in heat and are going to oxidize and basically become free radicals and be causing damage in your body. It's just one more thing that your body's going to have to neutralize and take care of. So I don't recommend cooking with vegetable oils whenever you can avoid it. Saturated fats are the best for cooking with. And then let's just talk about one more type of fat that's in your food. So I'm kind of throwing a fourth one in here on you, and that's trans fatty acids. There are some trans fatty acids that are naturally occurring in foods, and those ones are actually healthy. However, most of the trans fats that we're going to find in our diets are man-made. And what they do is they take unsaturated fatty acids and they saturate them artificially in order to make them act more like a saturated fat, to be more solid at room temperature and to be more stable with cooking. The problem with that is that it makes a different type of bond in the structure that your body doesn't deal with the same as saturated fats. And just like monounsaturated fats, there's really no debate that they're good for you. With trans fats, there's really no debate that they're really bad for you. And so I recommend cutting out all trans fats from your diet. So you're going to find them mostly in commercial products. You're going to find them in the Crisco and shortening, margarine, and a lot of like commercial baked goods are going to be high in trans fatty acids. If it has a food label on it, it should list out trans fatty acids on the label. But if the serving amount is small enough that they have 1 gram or less than 1 gram, they can say 0. So also look at that ingredient list. And if you see any ingredient that says that it's hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil, then you know that it's a trans fat. So what fats should you be eating? So as a general rule, we're going to go back to, is it a real food source of fat or is it not? If you can figure out how to make it in your own kitchen, then it's probably a pretty healthy source of fat. So for example, butter, cream, lard, tallow, expeller pressed or cold pressed oils like olive oil or avocado oil, coconut oil, I could reasonably create those in my own kitchen. I can figure out how those are made. However, I would not be able to extract the oil from a piece of corn or a canola seed, for example. When it comes to cooking, you want to stick with your mostly saturated fat sources. So animal fats and coconut oil are going to be a lot more stable for cooking with. Your monounsaturated fats like olive oil or avocado oil might be great to use as a dressing or in situations where you're not going to be cooking the food, or at least not heating it very high. Get your omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids from whole food sources like nuts and seeds for the most part, and avoid buying them in oil form and using them in your kitchen that way. Whenever you're buying commercial products, they're used in those, and so you're going to get plenty of them from when you have to, go with a commercially made product, or when you're eating your nuts and seeds. You don't need to get them in the form of extra oils in your kitchen. Your omega-3 fatty acids you can get from seafood, flax seeds, chia seeds, leafy greens, supplements. The fats that I have in my own kitchen are coconut oil, beef tallow, lard, olive oil, avocado oil, and coconut oil. I find that those oils serve all of my purposes with preparing food that I need. So you may or may not just have had your mind blown a little bit talking about fats. Let's move on to talk about carbohydrates a little bit here. And I don't think I'm going to have as much to say about carbs as I did about fats, because I needed to correct a few misconceptions. But let's talk about smart carbs. So smart carbs, I like to fill the carbohydrate section of my plate with whole fruits. Fruits can be fresh, they can be frozen, they can be dried, or even occasionally canned in juice or light syrup. Keep in mind that if they're dried, you're going to be getting a lot more sugars in a smaller amount of food because the water, of course, is gone. And so you might be able to eat an entire apple in only a few bites, and it's not going to feel like as much food. So just be careful with dried fruits that you're not just overindulging on those and eating way too much. I also like to include starchy vegetables there. So your more starchy vegetables are going to be things like potatoes and corn. But there's also some other vegetables that are kind of borderline. Some people consider them starchy, some people don't, such as your sweet potatoes or pumpkins, some of your squashes. And so I would consider those sweet potatoes probably on the starchy portion of my plate for right now. But if later on you find that you want to increase your carbohydrate intake a little bit, you might be able to include that sweet potato perhaps in the non-starchy vegetable section of the plate rather than the carbohydrate section of the plate. Hopefully that makes sense. Juices are going to have the water in them, but they're going to be stripped of a lot of the nutrients, and they're still going to have a lot of sugar in them. So I like to drink juices very sparingly in my diet and in small amounts. Another smart carb is going to be including whole grains in your diet. So whole grains in the research are associated with a lot of health benefits. However, there's a caveat here, because whole grains really need to be consumed with proper preparation, which nobody does anymore. And so they can actually cause some health problems. Let me explain. So if you think about the way that our ancestors ate grains, they never just ate it in the raw form and cooked it and ate it like we do today. Sometimes with oats even, we, eat them in a form where they're barely cooked at all. They always took the time to properly prepare the grains. So that means that they would soak them, they would allow them to sprout a little bit, or they would use them in something like a yeast sourdough bread that was different than the yeast we use today. It took a lot longer to process and rise and make the bread. The yeast in there had time to act on and break down and partially digest those grains that are in the bread, so that when we consume them, they're not so hard on our digestive systems. We are not designed like a ruminant or a horse to consume grains right off of the field. We require a little bit more preparation for our grains than that. And the reason for that is, there's several, but I'll talk about a couple of simple reasons. So let's talk about the anatomy of a grain for starters. So when we talk about a whole grain, we're actually literally talking about the whole grain. So when a grain comes off of the field, it has three main parts to it: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. So the bran is going to be kind of that darker brown outer layer around the grain that has a lot of fiber in it. And then the germ is going to be a little section of that seed that stores up tons of B vitamins and minerals and other things that are going to power that seed when it's time to grow for a while. And then the main part of the inside of that is going to be the endosperm, which is the starchy portion. There's not nearly as many vitamins and minerals in that portion, just a lot of starch. When we process grains from whole grains and turn them into a white grain, like a white rice or white flour, we are taking off that outer layer of the bran with all of the fiber, and we're taking out the germ with all of the vitamins and minerals in it, and we're leaving behind just the starchy portion. And so you are losing a lot of the beneficial parts of that grain. When you leave the whole grain intact, it is also going to come with some compounds such as phytates and lectins that are designed to protect that little seed from harm. They keep it fresh, and they are designed to cause damage to the consumer of that seed. So they will bind up certain nutrients that are essential for us, and they can also release toxins that are damaging to us and that will damage the lining of our gut as well. And so when we take the time to either soak, sprout, or ferment our grains, those processes are helping to neutralize and break down a lot of those phytates and lectins and other anti-nutrients that might be causing us harm. Those processes are also going to help to release a lot more of the nutrients that that little seed is holding on to for itself. Because if you think about when the seed starts to sprout, that is when it knows, hey, it's time to grow, it's time to release these nutrients so that that little seed can use them up as it grows up and as it establishes its root system. And so when you allow a grain to sprout, you are allowing those nutrients to be released so that they are also more bioavailable to you. Now, I don't want you to stress too much about the sources that you're getting your grains from, because in our modern way of living, we just don't prepare our grains that way anymore. They're harder to find. It's just not something that we learned how to do from our parents most of the time. And so if you find yourself in a position where it stresses you out to think about trying to find sprouted grains or figuring out how to do it yourself, that's okay. Just keep lower amounts of them in your diet for right now. And for the purpose of this week, I do want you to experiment a little bit, see what you can find. Try out finding some sprouted flowers or nuts and seeds even. We'll talk about those in a minute. Or maybe try soaking some of your beans or flowers overnight. There's tons of great resources online and in your workbook to lead you to some ideas for how to do that or where to buy them from in your meal plans. So click on those links, explore them a little bit. Try including about half of your grains this week as sprouted, soaked, or fermented, and just see how hard that is for you to include those in your diet and if it's something that you feel like you want to continue to do or not. When it comes to grains, I like to think of it on a stair-step ladder. So whole grains are generally good. Soaked grains are going to be a little bit better because they're going to lower the phytates but not necessarily the lectins in those grains. And then sprouted or fermented is going to be best. And so kind of think of it like that as you're choosing your grains. Now let's talk a little bit about protein. So with proteins, again, your beans, your nuts, your seeds, those are also the seed of the plant, and they're going to have a lot of the same properties and protective mechanisms and also harmful health effects as the whole grains are when they're not properly prepared. So you also want to soak or sprout or ferment your beans, nuts, and seeds as well before consuming them as often as possible. And luckily you can find a lot of sources on the market today for sprouted nuts and things like that. Check out your meal plan for the last 4 weeks. I've been linking to some resources. It's also really easy to do yourself. It's just remembering ahead of time to do it because it only takes about maybe 10 minutes of work, but you've got to remember a day or two ahead of when you want to use that food to make sure that you've taken the time to soak it or sprout it. What about when it comes to meats for your protein sources? How do you ensure that you're getting good quality there? So when you're buying your meats from the store, you want to be getting whole food sources of meats as much as possible. It's really difficult to find some of the types of meats without some extra ingredients injected into it. So read your labels for sure when you're buying your meats and try to buy sources that are just meat and you're not getting some surprise extra ingredients in there. There's probably some foods that you've been buying for meat at the store that you'll be surprised to see, oh, this has an ingredient list that's, 5 ingredients or 7 ingredients long. I thought I was just buying a piece of meat. So check that out. There's also the question of whether or not your meats need to be grass-fed. So you'll hear a lot of health professionals recommending that you get grass-fed meat because it's going to have a higher amount of omega-3 fatty acids. I'm not totally convinced on this reason for eating grass-fed meat because the proportion of total polyunsaturated fatty acids in there in the first place is pretty small. And then when you break that down even further between whether it's omega-6, which is going to be higher in your grain-fed or feedlot finished beef, as opposed to your omega-3 ratios, which will be higher in beef that has been totally grass-fed, there's really not going to be a whole lot of difference in how much omega-6s versus omega-3s you're getting there. That probably wouldn't be my go-to place to change that ratio in my diet. Your grass-fed beef is typically going to be more expensive, but let me just tell you about the differences and you can decide for yourself whether that cost difference is worth it for you. So your grass-fed beef is typically going to have less fat overall. It's going to have a different flavor than you're probably used to, more of a grassy flavor, quite honestly. The fat in it is going to be more yellowish. That is because if they're eating green grass, it's going to have a higher carotenoid content, those vitamin A precursors in the fat, which give it a yellowish color. It is found in several studies to have higher antioxidant contents like glutathione, which is a super important antioxidant. Grass-fed beef is also going to cook up differently than you might be used to with traditional meat that you would buy in the store. Your grain-fed meats going to have a slightly higher omega-6 fatty acid content in them, but it's really not going to be a great source of either omega-6s or omega-3s in your diet. They're going to typically be cheaper, and it's going to have more of the flavor that most people prefer. That said, I've heard some of my clients say that they do prefer the taste of the grass-fed beef, so it's really a preference thing. So you can decide for yourself if that's a place in your budget where you want to spend the extra money to get the grass-fed meats, or if you're okay with just the grain-fed feedlot finished beef. Now, I know I've given you a lot of information today, and really over the last 4 weeks you've been making a lot of changes in your diet. You've been spending a lot of time on the videos and the workbooks and the additional resources learning, and I just want you to know that, like we've talked about before, this is a time of hyper consciousness, and I do really want you to focus on yourself and your health and making these changes, because it really does require that focus and commitment for a short amount of time in order to really make the changes that you need to make to see a difference. So I encourage you to continue to commit to these things that you're learning. Also, don't get discouraged by those times when it feels like too much to think about the PFC on your plate or things like that. There's gonna be those times when you just don't want to put that much effort into a meal. And so second choice to the plate method and the PFC is going to be just fill your plate with real whole foods. You don't have to pay that much attention to the ratios all of the time, especially once you're feeling better. Just fill your plate with real foods, and they're going to have good effects on your body. This week I want you to revisit that plate graphic in your workbook. I provided another copy of it so that you can go back and add to it the new information that you've learned this week. Maybe you want to adjust some of the foods that you were putting on your plate. And all of these things that you've learned in the last 4 weeks are going to set you up to be really successful as you go into your LEAP protocol after you complete week 4, because you're going to know how to create a balanced plate even with the more limited choices you're going to have for a little while in your LEAP protocol. And you're going to be drinking plenty of water, balancing your blood sugars all along the way, and that's only going to boost your success with the protocol and moving forward after the protocol. Be sure that you go in near the end of this week before we have our scheduled consultation and look into the video about understanding your mediator release test results, and be sure to come to our appointment prepared with that information in your head so that you'll really be able to grasp the protocol that we create for you and be able to just run with it starting in week 5. Thank you for trusting me with your health in this journey, and I'm so excited to work with you moving forward to share in what you've learned and to share in the health benefits that you see from going through this program. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to do this with people. So good luck in week 4, and I will look forward to our consultation.